I will say the vast majority of Democrats are pro-law enforcement, and we believe that law
Tim Walz,
enforcement...
he says they're Gestapo.
Let me finish.
He says they're Gestapo.
Scott,
do you agree?
Scott,
do you agree?
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Bran Cooper, and today we're looking at a heated moment from CNN's Abby Phillip show where Scott Jennings clashes with the panel over law enforcement and Democratic rhetoric. This exchange comes out of the tragedy in Minneapolis, and it quickly turns tense as Jennings is repeatedly cut off while trying to make his point. What you're going to notice right away is how fast the conversation shifts from substance to control. The moment Scott pushes back on the claim that Democrats are uniformly pro-law enforcement, the interruptions start. Instead of letting the argument play out, the panel moves to talking over him, reframing his words, and rushing past the actual issue. There's a lot going on in this clip that needs to be unpacked carefully, so let's get into it.
Ana Navarro has joined us at the table. Ana, there were a lot of people who warned that, a massive increase in ICE presence on the ground would inevitably result in American citizens being the victims of some of these encounters.
Yeah, to me this day is very, very somber because I think there were so many indications that this was going to end up happening sooner or later. And it's a day where I think we need to be very sober. And I think, a few things. First, we live in America. We have a right to protest. We have a right to videotape what is happening and amplify the truth. But for the videos that were taken today, we wouldn't know the truth and we wouldn't be seeing it with our own eyes and able to judge it. Also, I think it's negligent that the ICE forces have been increased so quickly and that there's people without the proper training and the proper experience. I don't know if this agent who shot this woman today, I don't know if he's one of the new recruits that got offered $50,000 and maybe has less training and experience than ICE agents regularly do. And that might have been a contributing factor to how this ended up. Maybe if it had been an agent with more experience, the response would have been different. What I do know is that there's a 6-year-old boy who's now orphaned. His father died in 2023, and today his mother got shot to death. And I think it's a time of reflection in America. Protesters need to be peaceful. Protesters have every right to show up and demand accountability. But I also think our government has to be responsible in who they put out in the streets armed and the tone of what's happening with ICE. We've seen some agents really abuse power and almost relish what they are doing. We have seen pregnant women dragged through the streets. We have seen children left alone in cars. We have seen people shot. We have seen people chased like animals. Look, it's a very difficult situation, and we've got to reflect on how we do this so that it doesn't continue happening.
As you mentioned, it did seem to some people that we were headed in this direction because a couple of months ago, there was an incident involving another shooting with ICE agents. They shot into a vehicle and shot a woman. Then they charged her with trying to ram the law enforcement, but those charges were dismissed by a judge in part because of contradictory evidence that contradicted the ICE account of what happened in that incident. And I think all of this, to Anna's point, raises questions, Shermichael, for me, about this pact that we have between law enforcement and the citizenry, that under normal circumstances, when you get a badge and a gun, it's a huge amount of responsibility. And that responsibility also comes with, you show your face, you're accountable, you report to someone. And you also have, you have rules that you abide by. And that feels like the part that's missing here with ICE, that they've decided ICE agents don't need to show their faces. They don't need to abide by some of the basic principles that regular law enforcement officers do, even though they're engaging with the population at much greater degrees than they used to. Is it a moment to think about that and think about whether that is sustainable?
I'm sure I'm not opposed to having conversations about extended training. Look, if one wants to raise questions about shortening training, if you're going to have agents who don't typically act in law enforcement roles. I would not be opposed to that from my experience with law enforcement, broadly speaking. But even with well-trained officers, we have seen instances where officers have to make split decisions. And sometimes it's not nice. We shouldn't jump to conclusions by calling this guy a murderer. We don't know yet.
All right, this is where the framing starts to run away from the facts, and it's important to slow it down. The phrase split-second decision gets thrown around as if it's a blanket explanation for everything that happens afterward, but that's not actually what's being debated here. The key issue is not whether an officer had to make a rapid judgment in a tense situation. Those moments exist in all law enforcement. It's what happened after the immediate threat was over and how quickly the narrative hardened before all the facts were known. We're hearing a lot of speculation dressed up as certainty. Claims about training levels, recruitment incentives, and intent are being floated without confirmation, and that's exactly how public trust gets damaged. In situations like this, responsible leadership means waiting for verified information, not assigning motives or labels before investigations are complete. Jumping straight to conclusions doesn't serve justice, and it doesn't help families looking for real answers. There's also an effort here to paint ICE as fundamentally outside the norms of law enforcement. And that's a dangerous oversimplification. ICE agents, like other federal officers, operate under rules of engagement and accountability structures, even if those structures differ from local policing. That doesn't mean there can be oversight or review. There should be, but portraying federal enforcement as uniquely lawless before the facts are established is not analysis. It's advocacy. And this is where the broader political narrative creeps in. Instead of asking what actually happened, the conversation shifts to tone, optics, and sweeping generalizations about enforcement agencies as a whole. That's a familiar move. It turns a developing investigation into a symbolic indictment of border enforcement itself, which conveniently aligns with long-standing opposition to ICE rather than a genuine concern for due process. What's being lost in all of this is a basic principle that conservatives have consistently argued for. Accountability comes after facts, not before them. You can support law enforcement and still support investigations. You can demand transparency without assuming guilt. But once public figures start declaring outcomes and assigning blame in real time, they're no longer interested in truth. They're interested in shaping perception. And that's why this moment matters. Not because it proves one side right or wrong, but because it shows how quickly serious incidents get absorbed into pre-existing political narratives. If we actually care about justice, safety, and public trust, then the answer isn't shouting louder or rushing to judgment. It's letting the facts come out, holding everyone to the same standard, and resisting the urge to turn every tragedy into a talking point. Let's get back to the clip.
That's difficult to say. Someone has died. I acknowledge that. There's a child who's lost another parent. That doesn't make me comfortable or as a human being at all. But I do believe you have to empower law enforcement officials to do their jobs while assuring that you're also protecting the constitutional rights of citizens. And that's just the way I look at this.
But this looked to me like there was something very wrong because, I mean, you know, this ICE officer shot at least 3 times that we could hear on the video with other ICE officers very close to the driver, with people all around the car. With a moving car situation happening, and which resulted into that car careening into another car and a tree, and could have caused even more death and injuries. So I think we've got to acknowledge all of those things. I saw earlier today the former mayor of Miami-Dade, Carlos Jimenez, who is now a Republican from South Florida, a congressman from South Florida, huge Trump supporter. But when he was mayor of Miami-Dade, and he's also been a fireman for over 20 years. When he was mayor of Miami-Dade, he was the chief executive of the police department. And Jake asked him how he felt about this. And he said, I'm not ready to defend the ICE officer. I have serious questions. And I think we need to take off our partisan hats, and we need to look at this with, be very cold-headed, because what we need to work on is make sure to avoid these kind of situations in the future.
Chris Murphy said Democrats cannot vote for a DHS budget that does not restrain the growing lawlessness of this agency. And increasingly, I'm hearing and seeing a lot of Democrats basically saying, back when defund ICE was a position that some liberals were taking and moderates were saying, well, that's gone too far. Now more and more so-called moderates are saying this agency is out of control. When we retake power, we've got to do something about it. Do you think that's the right move?
I think any agency that has this much money behind them needs to have accountability, and it doesn't have that. And I think if there's any question to what Shermichael's making and what Anna is saying, this idea of like, we don't really know what happened. We don't know what the officer was thinking in this moment. It might come down to training. It might not come down to training. It looks like this. It looks like that. At the end of the day, she was pulled out of the car and she was not dead yet. And a doctor was on the scene and tried to help her. And the ICE officer said, get away from her or we'll shoot you. So they shot a woman and then threatened to shoot a man who was trying to help the woman. So if you're telling me that this was just a split-second decision, she might have been saved. But her wife had to watch her bleed out on the ground while a doctor stood by with an ICE officer with a gun in his face. So I don't know what we're talking here.
In that aftermath.
Well, they've spoken to the doctor.
Right. No, yeah. And I think my point is that what transpired after she was shot, did they render aid? Did they allow aid to be rendered to her? Again, this is all part of the picture that Americans are seeing, and they're asking, what's going on here?
Well, they're all fair questions and should all be part of a legitimate investigation. I think that's what the American people would expect. I mean, a lot of people witnessed this. There have been a lot of witnesses on television today. We played some. I saw another interview with another witness who said that this lady in the van was the leader of a convoy that was attempting to impede and obstruct the road where legitimate law enforcement operations were taking place. I would also like to know if that is true, because that's what an eyewitness has said. If that is true, I think one of the questions we have to ask is, why are people believing that it is okay to create vehicle convoys for the purpose of impeding federal law enforcement? My suspicion is it's because they've been told by politicians that it is their responsibility to do so. It is, in fact, a felony to obstruct federal law enforcement activities. If you don't like the immigration laws, that's a legitimate position, but you don't change laws by creating convoys to obstruct law enforcement officers. You call the politicians and ask them to change the laws. Political vigilantism is getting people killed. This lady should not be dead. I hate it that she is dead, because this poor kid, as Anna said, is an orphan. I don't love in any way, shape, or form that someone is dead, but we have to ask ourselves hard questions about why people are putting themselves in these positions. And we've seen it all over the country.
Because they're Americans and they can't stand what they are seeing. I don't think it's.
Does that mean you can impede a law enforcement officer?
No, but that wasn't the case on January 6th either. And they were pardoned. And just this week, they were marching down the street to the Capitol again. Why are you shaking your head?
Because this cannot be your go-to.
But no, I'm not saying that.
On January 6th,
I am pro-law enforcement.
Democrats said we're pro-law enforcement. Today they say they're Gestapo. Which is it? Which is it?
No, I will say the vast majority of Democrats.
I want to close on this because this is where these conversations often lose clarity. When moments like this happen, the debate almost immediately turns into a political tug of war instead of a careful examination of what actually occurred. One side frames it as proof of systemic failure, the other frames it as an attack on law enforcement as a whole, and somewhere in between, the facts get drowned out by rhetoric. What's getting lost is that two things can be true at the same time. Law enforcement officers operate in difficult, high-pressure environments, and those realities deserve acknowledgement. But that does not mean every action taken is automatically justified, nor does it mean questions about conduct, training, or post-incident response are unreasonable. Accountability and due process are not opposites. They're supposed to work together. When people hear phrases like split-second decision, it's important to ask what part of the timeline that phrase actually applies to. Immediate decisions in a volatile moment are one thing. Actions taken afterward, communication, medical access, transparency, and official responses are another. Conflating those phases prevents a clear understanding of what went right, what went wrong, and what could be improved going forward. There's also a broader issue here about public trust. Trust doesn't come from rushing to judgment in either direction. It comes from consistent standards, clear investigations, and leaders who resist the urge to politicize tragedy before the facts are established. When conclusions are announced too quickly, it hardens positions and makes constructive dialogue almost impossible. And for the public watching these panels, the frustration is understandable. People want to know whether procedures were followed, whether mistakes were made, and whether safeguards exist to prevent similar outcomes in the future. They don't want slogans. They don't want talking points. They want clarity, fairness and accountability applied evenly. This is exactly why measured conversations matter. Not every question is an accusation, and not every investigation is an indictment. The goal should always be learning what happened, why it happened, and how to reduce the chances of it happening again without assuming motives or assigning blame prematurely. This is Bran Cooper. I'm genuinely interested in how you see this. Do you think these discussions are helping the public understand what's going on, or do they create more confusion and division? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you value long-form, careful breakdowns like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.